Welcome to the Summer School of Time, and thanks for joining our session on labor reduction, the 4-day work week versus reducing working hours. My name is Atika Schubert, and I am a journalist based in Valencia, Spain. I recently did a story on CNN Travel about the new draft law and the debate around working time here in Spain, and that's how I was introduced to the Time Use Initiative. So I'm very excited to be hosting this panel today. We have a lot of people who are joining. We have a number of people who are registering for today's session. So thank you for those who are joining now. We also have an excellent panel of speakers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly introduce them, then go over the structure of the session before we jump in to the discussion. So very quickly on our panel today, we have Giovanni Casale. He is the senior advisor at the European Trade Union Confederation. That is, of course, a very powerful voice for labor in Europe. We have also Grace Western, who is a consultant and researcher at the Autonomy Institute that is pioneering the 4-day work week in the UK and in other countries as well. We also have Dale Whelan, the Chief Executive Officer of 4-Day Week Global, currently planning, as we were discussing earlier, pilot programs in more than 20 countries for that 4-day week. So very ambitious plans. And last but not least, we have Mariluz Vega, honorary consultant of the Complutense University of Madrid, formerly with the International Labour Organization, works very closely, obviously, with the Time Use Initiative, but most importantly, especially for those of in Spain, helping to draft Spain's new time use law, which we'll hear more about later from here. So here are the structure for the session, just to give you an idea. I'm going to have two questions for our first two speakers, which will be Giovanni Casale and it will be Grace Western. Then we'll break into a kind of debate, looking at the pros and cons of the 4-day work week versus an overall reduction in daily work hours. And in the last 20 minutes or so of the session, we are going to open it up for questions to the audience, and we'll ask you to direct them to a specific speaker. So we should have a lot of time to get into a really good discussion on this. Now, before we jump in to this debate, I do want to take a quick poll, and we're going to take a poll at the very beginning of the session, and then we're going to take a poll at the end to see if any of our thinking has shifted. So take a look at your screens. There should be, I think, on the YouTube channel there, 3 questions that are going to pop up. And if you could take a minute to answer them quickly, we'll be able to look at the results fairly soon. So let me take a look at questions very quickly. The first question is, which work schedule do you prefer? A 4-day work week, reduced daily working hours, or no preference? Second question is, what do you believe is the most significant benefit of labor reduction? Improved work-life balance, increased productivity, enhanced employee well-being, or environmental sustainability? You can only choose one. I know it seems like there may be more than one, but that's all we can do for this. Which of the following do you think is the biggest challenge in reducing labor hours? Maintaining productivity levels, client or customer expectations, economic feasibility for companies, or employee adaptation for new schedules? So if you could just take a quick minute to answer that poll, and hopefully we'll get some results for those. It's a debate that's been going on in Spain for quite some time, and I'm sure it's been happening in other countries as well. We'll be getting a perspective from a number of panelists about the kinds of trends and what we're seeing in other countries. But it'll be interesting to see what people participating in this think about this particular issue. So we'll get into those poll here, and then we'll hopefully get some results on that, and then be able to compare that to the poll results we get at the end. Just make sure I can see everything fine. Why don't we get started with the first question while we wait for some of those poll results to come in. And what I'd like to do at the very beginning of this is really just get a snapshot of what we're seeing in Europe. Oh, sorry. Let me just update with some of those poll results that we already have in. What kind of schedule do people prefer? We have reduced daily working hours is a 57%. So a majority of you would rather see reduced daily workers than a 4-day work week. 28% asked for that, and 14% had no preference. So that's interesting. I mean, we'll see whether or not that changes as a result of this debate. But at the moment, the preference is to sort of stick with the more or less the schedule I think a lot of people have currently, but just reducing that 8-hour working day. We'll see if that changes at all. And I think we might also see some changes in opinion on the benefits of how we benefit most from reducing working hours. I think there's a lot of answers to that. Oh, maybe we already have some of those here. What do you believe the benefit is? 80% said work-life balance. I don't think that's a surprise for a lot of people, especially during COVID. I think that was a really big aspect of our daily lives, was trying to find a proper work-life balance. 20% also said one benefit would be enhanced employee well-being. Interestingly, nobody has voted for increased productivity or environmental sustainability. And I think that's very surprising because environmental sustainability, in fact, is one of those things that I think, especially with the Autonomy Institute, has shown that there really is a benefit to economic sustainability. And I'm not sure do we have the final questions for the results for that, for the biggest challenges? I can imagine for employers and organization leaders, they have a lot of questions on, on the bigger challenges of how to make this happen. Well, while we wait for those answers to come in, why don't we get a snapshot of what's happening overall in Europe with Giovanni Casali. What I'd like to do is start with just a basic question for you, Giovanni, because you're dealing so much with trade unions representing workers. What do you see as the main problems for European workers when it comes to work time organization? You've dealt so much with trade unions trying to make some change on this. What are the biggest challenges you're seeing?
Thank you, Atika, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting the European Trade Union Confederation to this first summer school on time policies. Let me first start saying that the use of time, and in particular initiatives like working time reduction, are topics quite new, recent for the ETUC. I mean, we started discussing internally with our affiliates 3-4 years ago. So it's quite recent as a topic. And in our last Congress, Berlin 2023, in our document, the action program from 23 to 27, the ETUC is clearly stated that the ETUC commits to facilitate and support the union and other initiatives, campaigns to reduce the working time while maintaining the full pay. So it clearly stated in our Congress document. And as I said, we started the internal discussion with our affiliates 3 years ago. As for the background, I pretty much agree what was being discussed in some policy brief about the need to have this cultural shift at the moment, considering that we still working 40 hours like we did almost 100 years ago. So all the automation, technological progress needs to be taken into account, because also we have modernized our production systems. But we didn't modernize our working week time. To answer to your question, so regulation of working time for European workers actually still faces several challenges that might vary by country and by industry, of course, but generally I can list some of those, like many European workers are still facing long working hours despite the regulation in place. And this, as you know, can easily lead to burnout, stress, and poor work-life balance as the main answer we got in the poll. Also, another issue is that notwithstanding the recent directive on working on transparent and predictable working condition in the EU, there are still irregular and unpredictable working schedules. especially in sectors like hospitality, healthcare, retail. This is also difficult for, makes difficult for workers to plan their personal lives. Another issue that I think it's relevant, it's overtime. We have excessive overtime, unpaid overtime in some countries, and this remains remain a concerns. Also because very often workers feel pressured to work beyond their contract without an appropriate compensation. We mentioned already work-life balance, and just to link it with someone, you mentioned the COVID, the pandemic, and the fact that most of us, or all of us, worked remotely. So while the remote work has been beneficial, but it's also brought issues like extended working hours, difficulty to switch from work to personal life, and with inadequate home office setups. And this is linked also to the digitalization and work intensification. So linked to the previous point, the rise of digital tools, having a working phone always with us, or a laptop always to bring home. So the rise of this tool led to a sort of blurring of boundaries between work and personal time. This increased the expectation for workers to be constantly available and responsive. And this is why we at the TUC, we are also pushing for the right to disconnect directive. Other concerns, other issues are, of course, the health and safety concerns, occupational health and safety, exacerbating poor work time organization. This could lead to physical and mental health. This is another topic we really care about, because we saw like a pandemic after the pandemic. So after the COVID pandemic, we are seeing now more and more people in burnout or with mental or health issues due to work-related stress. And a final just to finish this first set of questions, the final issue I see is also on the economic side, because sometimes a precarious working condition or economic instability, so the need to have a job security, can push workers actually to accept not very favorable working condition, including longer hours or irregular working week hours.
You make a really good point there about the blurring of boundaries from COVID. On the one hand, it's the ability to increase our flexibility, but it does blur those boundaries between work and personal life. I'm wondering, with all of these challenges that you've listed out that we see across Europe, and with your experience in collective bargaining, we know that the Time Use Initiative has put forward several proposals to try and reduce working time, even for different types of jobs and so forth. What do you find has worked best when it comes within that framework, when it comes to collective bargaining?
Thank you. Yes, I read with attention the policy brief, and I found it very interesting and well done. I agree with the 6 goals and the key measures. Let me just to also go to answer to the poll. At the TUC, we do not have a clear position among our affiliates. What's best between 4-day working week or reducing working hours per week? These mixed feelings, and I think that what's happening now in many collective bargaining agreements in different countries, they are gradually reducing the working time, the working week, and this is a positive sign. I think there is this momentum now after the pilots Thanks also to organization present in this panel. After the pilots, public debate, as you said, is increasing around this topic, and luckily, many collective agreements are reflecting this gradual reduction of working week. So this is the first point, gradually reducing, and we are looking with attention of what's happening in Spain. We think that the proposal it's quite fair to gradually reduce by law to cap the maximum hours, working hours to 37.5 hours by 2025, if I'm not wrong. And then also at the same time launching a platform with the social partners, with trade unions and employers involved to commonly agree to probably even reduce even further up to 32. Why not? This is I'm Italian. I'm working in Brussels, representing European workers, but I'm Italian, and I'm glad that in Italy actually this debate is gaining support. Couple of months ago, there's been the first law proposal from the oppositions to reduce the working week up to 34 or 32 hours. And at the same time, there are already several companies that adopted collective agreements, so company agreements, but company agreements to reduce the working time gradually, even just 2 hours less per week. But it doesn't. This means that people can get out from workplace half an hour before. They can have half an hour to spend more with their families, with their children, or to go to grocery shops. Why not? And this has a lot of benefits, but we will talk about later about benefits and the cons. And also sectoral agreements, actually. In Italy, we also recorded a couple of sectoral national agreements in the banking sector and some in the food industry. As I said, very, very low. We're passing from 38.5 to 36, but still, it's less time we spend at workplace, and we can use it for doing other activities. For the moment, I will stop here.
Okay, thank you. That is a lot. And actually, it's very encouraging to see that you have in Italy and across Europe these kinds of trends, this gradual discussion and acceptance of the need to reduce working time. So that's very encouraging to hear. Just a quick update on that poll. We were able to get the poll answers for the last question. The biggest challenge in reducing labor hours, the majority said the biggest challenge was maintaining productivity levels. At 54%, people were, that was their biggest concern. Otherwise, it was a pretty even split between economic feasibility and client or customer expectations at 18%. Only about 9%, I think, were worried about employee adaptation to schedules. So, oops, hold on just a second. We're going to move now to Grace's presentation. And what I'm particularly interested from Grace is the trends that we're seeing, particularly across Europe, because I know that the Autonomy Institute has been working with the Icelandic government, the Valencian government, I think the Scottish government as well. So you're in a good position to give us trends across Europe, Grace. Let us know. Go ahead and tell us.
Thank you so much, Atika. I really appreciate it. As Atika mentioned, I'm Grace Western. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a consultant and researcher on the future of work and work time reduction at the Autonomy Institute based out of the UK, where I work closely with organizations across different sectors and industries, trialing and implementing work time reduction. So I hope folks don't mind. I pulled together some few slides because I'm a bit of a visual learner, so I thought that might be helpful with the trends. And I also want to say thank you so much to the Summer School of Time for having me today, and it's an honor to be alongside these brilliant panelists. So I'll spend roughly the next 10 minutes talking about trends happening across Europe, but first I'll just do a quick grounding of what I do at the Autonomy Institute, as Atika mentioned. So our area of expertise lies in the future of work, and we develop policy around the changing nature of work and technological innovation. And we also have a consultancy where we work with clients from the private, public, and third sector to help organizations trial and transition to work time reduction. And our approach is really no one size fits all. And so that includes the models of work time reduction applied. So whether that's the 4-day week, whether that's a 5-day week with shorter hours, or that could also look like annualized hours for organizations that maybe have seasonal busy period. And really with that, we believe that workers should be a part of co-designing the model for their work time reduction, and so that the best model really reflects their needs and their experiences at work, but also outside of work. So my perspective here for today's session is covering trends across Europe, but this is grounded in the work that I do on a daily basis with companies, workers, unions, and what they're saying about work time reduction. Okay. So let's dive in. So this graph from the why and how of working time reduction shows the general downward trend in working hours over the last roughly 150 years. So we have France here, Germany, the Netherlands, UK, Sweden, the US, and the EU average. And generally, we can see how working hours in these countries have declined on a whole. And then we see kind of they've relatively stagnated since the 1980s and 1990s. And then we've seen kind of renewed surgence during COVID and post-COVID about people's relationship with work and how it's shifted, and kind of, as Giovanni said, kind of those blurred boundaries. Though, of course, there was union action and other trials happening before COVID as well. So I just want to note there's 2 additional considerations about general working time that aren't as obvious from first glance at this graph, which is that women en masse entered the labor market after World War II. Obviously, there were women in the labor market before that as well. So there are more people working in the formal labor market than ever. So the number of hours being collectively worked is higher. And then, of course, this graph would also insinuate that there's reduced working time generally. But it's important to note that care work, predominantly carried out by women, as well as other unpaid labor, isn't captured here. So it's important to think about women entering the formal labor market and still carrying out their unpaid care work and the amount of work that is. And I just like to ground us in that when we think about work and what work is and how much time we're spending working. And so then why we're interested also in reducing formal working time. And then secondly, as Giovanni mentioned already, the nature of work has shifted, particularly 21st century onwards. We spend more time thinking about work, around work. There's blurred boundaries, like work eats into our personal time. And so we're really seeing kind of the creep of that. And in some countries, as like in the UK, we're also seeing overtime is increasing steadily since COVID. So really to conclude, even though we've seen a reduction of working time over the last 150 years with stagnation roughly in the last 30, we're actually working more collectively in many ways, even if it's unaccounted for. So I think that's a really good grounding to see why we're fighting for this and moving for this now. So recent trends, we've really seen the public profile of work time reduction growing. We're seeing an increased demand from the workforce. One recent study found 78% of UK workers want a 4-day week. And we're also seeing the reasons why people want work time reduction. A 2023 Industrial Europe Working Time Survey found that the most common response from manufacturing unions for seeking reduced working time was for work-life balance. And while this isn't necessarily representative of the entire workforce, it gives us a glimpse of sentiment. And additionally, well-being at the top of the priorities mimics what we're hearing with organizations as well, and kind of what we're seeing in the poll already from this session. So, and those issues kind of trickle down into issues of reduced stress, burnout, increased retention, recruitment, among other things. So I also find it useful to think about the main actors implementing work time reduction. So we see trade unions, as we've been talking about, pushing for in collective bargaining agreements, and trade unions have always been one of the main actors pushing forward and ensuring workers are at the forefront of pushing for work time reduction, as well as designing their models. We also see the government backing public sector trials or public funded trials, and the government can be a really useful way to set standards across various industries where it could be more complex to organize. And then we also see the private sector implementing work time reduction within individual organizations and broader pilots. And what's not captured here is the role of organizers and campaigners who are pushing all of these actors into kind of pursuing work time reduction. So I use this framing just to kind of help us understand the trend better. So to visualize this a bit more, here's some examples of how this is playing out across Europe. So for government policy and trials, we've seen trials in Iceland and Portugal and ongoing ones in Spain, Belgium, and Scotland. Iceland's public sector trial was renowned widely as successful and then led to unions successfully negotiating to have it in other sectors. So now 86% of their workforce either have shorter working weeks or the right to them. We've also seen trade unions really driving the force behind working time reduction. As of last week, a healthcare worker union in Sweden is on strike to demand shorter working hours, and almost a third of their union membership report being part-time, as they state that they're physically unable to do their full work time hours. To work full-time is physically too demanding. And then IG Metall, which represents over 2 million workers in Germany, has been pushing for work time reduction for a long time. And we also see plenty of private sector trials happening, also nodding to Dale at 4-Day Week Global, who's leading up on many of these. So we see these in Ireland, the UK, which Autonomy was a part of as well, and a recent one that launched in Germany this year. So I'm also now just going to run through a couple of specific countries and what that looks like in the different models versus 4-Day Week, 5-Day Week, etc. So I want to start with Belgium because they released a 4-Day Week compressed hours policy that hasn't really received great uptake. Less than 1% of workers have decided to currently employ that policy. And I just want to highlight this form of a 4-Day week. I wouldn't consider work time reduction. There has been kind of a trend where we're seeing compressed hours into a 4-Day week, but you're still working the same hours, even if you're working one fewer day. And so you're not going to see the same benefits. And it's really important, I think, to not conflate any 4-Day week as a shorter working week or as work time reduction. We've also kind of seen this policy playing out in France right now, where the Prime Minister proposed a compressed 4-Day week for public sector workers and divorced parents. We also see Belgium has other government-led 4-Day week pilots with reduced working hours, but that hasn't seen great uptick as of right now. Germany is also a great example of kind of movement happening within all three actors. They had their private sector pilot launch this year, as I mentioned. They have their left political party outlined a proposal for a 32-hour work week and arguing that government should set the labor market standard. And as I mentioned, IG Metall has been calling for work time reduction for a long time. And then I'm also going to highlight Spain. And of course, there's many other wonderful things happening. And I know Maddie Luz will talk more about that. But just to kind of hone in on two specific ones, we saw the Valencia pilot, which happened for a month in 2023, which was a 4-Day week. And folks reported lower stress, reduced carbon emissions in traffic, and benefits to children. And we've also seen the Spanish government and the Ministry of Industry providing subsidies for companies who are working with a 10% reduction in work time. So you're seeing kind of both the 4-Day working week being employed and then as well kind of a 10% reduction that's not specific about the model. So I think it's important to highlight that we're seeing kind of that happen in different ways. So ultimately, just what I think it's kind of important to hone in on the trends we're seeing is what is work time reduction. In many ways, it's 10 to 20% decrease with no loss in pay, which is often what we talk about, but it can be other meaningful ways of work time reduction, as well as kind of the initiative in Spain to decrease over time those 2 hours. And compressed hours, so some of the proposals we've seen in Belgium and France, i.e. the 4-Day week with compressed hours, is not necessarily work time reduction, and you're not going to see the same benefits that you would if you were doing work time reduction. And then ultimately, no one size fits all. We see that kind of in relationship to the panel today. Is it a 4-Day week? Is it a 5-Day week with shorter hours? And the answer is, at least from our perspective, there is no right answer. The worker and the person and the company and the organization will know what that looks like. And the worker-led or co-design of the model will help figure out which roles make sense. That will also look different across different industries. And there's also the ability to ensure equity if you use a percent reduction model and not just specific structures. So say you have a service-heavy industry or service-heavy part of a team and they're not going to be able to work a 4-day week. But if they have a 10% reduction and can build a model that looks like that, and other parts of their organization do the same, then you're kind of ensuring equity in that work time reduction. So ultimately, we see a variety of trials and policies happening across Europe. And this is just kind of a quick overview, and excited to get into it more with the rest of the panelists. So I'll stop there and excited to talk about this.
Cool. Thank you so much, Grace. Those some really interesting data there. And it does seem exactly echoing what Giovanni said, that there is this groundswell to reduce the hours of the work week. It's just a question of how you do it, the nuts and bolts and what all the different kind of challenges different jobs and industries have. So to get into that, if we can all agree that there's definitely a need to reduce working hours, we're going to bring in Mariluz Vega and Dale Wheelahan. First, though, I'd like for Mariluz to give us some perspective on what's happening specifically in Spain. If you could present to us, Mariluz, you've been drafting this new law for Spain, this time use law. If you could give us a brief summary of it, and what is this law proposing?
Thank you, Attica, and good afternoon to everyone, and nice to meet everyone, even like this with the connection. I would try to also go as fast as Grace to try to give you some ideas. We need to concentrate on the idea that this proposal of changing working time has been based in a very broad proposal on drafting a new law on use of time in general, because we think that we will only change working time. This will be not enough to change really and to attend all the needs of the society. Then the proposal is, the working time proposal is a part of a biggest one that tries to reorganize the use of time in Spain. That is a country that has a scarcity of time because of different habits. I know everyone has been once at least in Spain to pass, and which is our lunchtime, our TV times, etc. What we have proposed is a set of different amendments to the workers' chart, what we call Estatuto de los Trabajadores, is the workers' chart that is more or less 50-year-old. And we have, and has suffered different reforms, but we have been concentrated on the idea to reduce the working time in a progressive manner than I think has been in the newspapers reflected. The first one is to reduce this year and next year to 37.5 hours. And in 10 years more, we will try to reach the 32 hours as a general need. But it's not the only thing that we have proposed, because we can not only reduce working time, the weekly working time, we need to do in a different way, and we need also to reorganize things like rest, overtime, part-time, organization of work, compensation. In Spain, there were really measures that were not matching in some cases with international law. I have been working at the island. I would say that we have some problems in relation to the compensation of overtime and night work. Night work is sometimes, and the shift work is not used in a proper way. And all this is related because we have been contemplating all the different, I would say, aspect and nuance of the idea of how to reduce time to improve workers' life. It is very clear that if we need to improve health, and if we need to improve also productivity and flexibility, we need to have a very big approach. What is the proposal? What tries this proposal to meet is to propose some flexibility in a broader manner. Flexibility for enterprises and for workers. A lot is led to the negotiation, to collective agreements that are quite developed in Spain, but with minimums that need to be respected. These minimums are mainly this reduction of the hour. Also, we have proposed to have 2 full days of rest, to reduce the number of hours allowed when you are on night work, always compensation and reduction of overtime. I would say is really a set of measures, very difficult to present in only 5 minutes, because there are more or less 30 pages of explanation. We have been also trying to modernize the law, following which has been the different hours from the courts, from the Spanish court, and also from European Union, as well as to follow the recent directives on working condition or family responsibilities. We'll say a mixture, this proposal, of this idea of trying to improve working time and protection of workers in this particular issue, to modernize the law in relation with international law, and also to give more autonomy to the parts to negotiate and to be free in this framework of reduction that is the most important. This is I would say in a nutshell, what is the reform or the proposal, because we can go to many details.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that because I know it's hard to condense it all into a very short period of time. So I really do appreciate it. And I think it's very interesting what you say, because it's not simply about reducing those working hours, right? It's about all of these overall things, the compensation, as you point out, getting those 2 full days of rest is so important. And it's about building in that kind of flexibility. So it's fascinating that as you try and put it in a legislative framework. I want to bring in Dale first, before we get into more of the debate on the pros and cons. And specifically, Dale, I'm really interested in your perspective, because if I'm not wrong, you came to this from a healthcare perspective, which is very different. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into it, but why you see there is a need for a reduction in work hours in the work week.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much to the organizers as well for having us here, and for the brilliant speakers already. Not to re-echo some of the great points that have been made. My own background was originally in physiotherapy training, so I've always been quite interested in the health and well-being of people, and particularly the confounding role that stress can play on actually exacerbating many of the physical and mental health issues that people face, not just in early life, but actually in the early onset of chronic disease in later life as well, which creates huge strain on many healthcare systems. I went from my undergraduate into a PhD program in the behavioral sciences, and took, I suppose, a more focused look on work, and looked at sleep deprivation and fatigue in surgeons. As a profession, surgery is actually grounded and founded from a training scheme created by a guy called William Halsted, who was actually addicted to stimulants when they did a posthumous kind of examination on him. So it made me realize, I suppose, we need to look back at the foundations of how we've decided to work the way we have in order to decide whether they're actually working for us, which I'm sure we'll get into today. I was quite interested in well-being interventions within the world of work, and realizing actually this tokenistic form of well-being intervention that many businesses are now investing in is not really moving the dial on mental health issues within the workplace. And working with some colleagues in Oxford, I've spoken, Dr. William Fleming in particular has done a huge amount of research and found that we do need organizational level and structural change in order to actually move the dial on the workplace factors that are causing people to feel unwell in the first place. So 4-Day Week acts as one of those interventions in order to motivate an entire organization to figure out what's not working. Because when forced to actually reduce working time, they are also forced to reflect on the issues that are causing them to waste time in the first place. And they tend to be issues of poor leadership and poor culture and poor communication, all of which also feed into worsening mental health for people in their experiences in workplaces as well.
Mariluz, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to the conclusion for reduced working time. I mean, why do we need it? If the average person on the street says to you, but I'm fine with 8 hours, what would you say to them? Why do we need to have reduced working hours?
Well, there are first reason that I think we need to consider. We have been with the same proposal of working time of 40 hours per week since more than 100 years ago. Then if we see the labor market, and Grace has shown, we cannot consider anymore this. And in Europe, in particular, in the 60s, every country more or less in Europe has already accepted in law, later it's another question in practice, the reduction of working time to 40 hours. If we see what is happening in the practice now, most of the workers in the formal sector and not in precarious work, and it's another business that we can deal with, they are working less than 40 hours in reality. The average is around 37, 38. Then we are late. Already we are late in reducing working time. This is the first question. Later, there are all these amount of reasons that has been already mentioned, and I don't need to repeat. In particular, because of the changes of the society and labor market. One of the first one, of course, is health. And there are terrible effects of the overtime or the bad organization of time in health, but also the need of conciliation. I think the presence of the woman in the labor market has a lot to say about these needs. And also we need to consider different aspects. I say the need is, we need to change working time, but it's not the only thing that we need to change. I was mentioned before, the question of precarity is not the subject that we need to deal now, but is what we need to all consider is time to review our society, and working time is a main issue in Europe. And I think it's something that we cannot avoid anymore.
I'm wondering, Dale, because you're specifically looking at the 4-day work week and that you're running several pilot programs. What do you see? I mean, when you're talking with organizations, when you're talking with workers, what do you see as the main benefits? What do you tell them in terms of how you can benefit, not just with employee well-being, but also with productivity? What's the case that you make to them?
Yeah, thank you. And so to echo Grace's point, 4-day week is kind of a catch-all phrase. It's the one that allows us to stimulate conversation, but ultimately what we're most interested in is working time reduction. So when we look at the trials that we conduct and how organizations implement versions of a 4-day week, they will, by and large, implement Monday through to Thursday working time, or Tuesday through to Friday. But we also see experimentation with 5 shorter working days equivalent to a 32-hour work week as well. So again, we're not prescriptive. We're interested in understanding what that landscape looks like for different industries of different sizes and in different cultures. We go 4-day week global was actually founded as a productivity business. So Andrew Barnes, when trialing it on his own company, Perpetual Guardian, wasn't so much interested in the health and well-being of his workforce as much as he had looked back at previous stuff conducted by the likes of Henry Ford, who brought in a 5-day work week for productivity gains as well. So we have always had at the core of our studies this framework of 100-80-100. So we're interested in maintain of salary at 100%, reduction of working time to 20%, but also how can you maintain levels of performance or productivity or output, whatever that means for your industry. So that provides sufficient guarantees for all the important stakeholders that this is something that is worth experimenting with. When we look at it, and this is where my behavior science, I'm sorry if I take over here, but I look at it from the individual all the way up to the organization and the broader society as well. When people feel that they have more time, they get what's called the fulfillment of basic psychological needs. So they feel like they have more control over their lives, they're able to rest more, they feel like they're doing a better job outside of work, and they feel more connected to the people that is important to them. That returns huge benefits then when the worker actually is in work. They feel more engaged, they feel more revitalized. But actually the changes that organizations undergo as well in order to make the 4-day week actually work from a productivity point of view as well also leads to those productivity gains. So we see this deliberate focus on reducing unproductive time in the workday. So long meetings being replaced with shorter forms of communication, technology being used for time reduction, not time creation, and all of those sort of growth mindset approaches to being smarter with how we work when we know we have a more limited time to work. And so we see the mindset of the worker change, and also more importantly, manager effectiveness change as well. So managers become much more deliberate in understanding what are the key indicators that are going to drive the business forward, and therefore we must prioritize those activities and deprioritize activities that aren't as important for us. So there is a change in skill set and mindset amongst both management and non-management. That then leads to a ripple effect of benefits for teams. So you get this augmentation of the team unit within workplaces. We know from research when teams work well together, they produce more than when they work individually. And broader then we see these benefits for organizations in growth of revenue. We saw that in the UK trial that Grace was mentioning. We also see broader benefits for women within workplaces, disproportionate benefits in health outcomes for women relative to men. We see that distribution of household labor and parenting responsibilities increasing by 2 men, because it is a policy for all, not just a policy for those who wish to take it up. And then we see the impacts for people's health as well. So they're more physically active, they're sleeping better, they're reporting lower levels of stress, all of which we know are drivers for improving people's performance as well. So it's a very fundamental different approach to management. It's not focused on an outdated paradigm from the 20th century of the worker as a unit in a cog in a machine in what was a very physically laborsome workforce. Instead, we need to recognize that work is highly cognitive and emotional now, and the brain fatigues at a much quicker rate than the body. So we need to harness our understanding of the psychology and the physiology of people in order to understand how we can optimize human performance. And we all know that if we look at any elite industry, stress plus rest equals that growth. Elite athletes, aviation, nuclear industry, they all prioritize the importance of rest in order to perform better.
Yeah, you make a really compelling argument there for companies who are, if they can see the productivity gains, then they're thinking less about the challenges or what they perceive could be their losses from something like that. So that's really fascinating. Mariluz, my next question is for you, because as you point out, Spain suffers from a kind of time poverty for a number of reasons. It's some of it's cultural, some of it's just literally the time and that falls here. So why did you choose to take the sort of progressive way that you did in this draft law? What are for you the benefits of pursuing work reduction hours in this way?
We have poverty and we are proud of. This is the more complicated thing, I would say. The idea, in some way, Dale was also mentioned, what we need is really working reduction. And we will look for a form or a formula that will allow flexibility. The reduction was the most important, to fix limits, as I have mentioned. And secondly, we have not excluded the possibility to have, for example, a 4 weeks system, if you like to call like this, because we are proposing also to have this kind of, we call hours bank of hours, that we can put in like we say, weekly, a little bit like Grace was explaining on Germany, that you can work sometimes 10 hours per day and you compensate. But all depends, because we need to consider not only individual needs, but also productivity needs. What enterprise really wants, and they are not, I will say they are not opposite to have this reduction, at least the 37.5 hours. The 32 will be another issue, but now the 37.5 is what we like, is to have some flexibility, because they need to reorganize work. What is more important, I would say, is to have possibilities that all can be done, but I would say all in terms of organization, but protecting workers and improving productivity is what the approach has been taken, to consider all like a fully condensed idea around working time, but also with this possible arrangement through collective agreement that we feel is the most important mean. And in Spain, collective agreements are law, then it's the more secure way to improve any change.
So I'm wondering what kind of adjustments then need to be made? And Dale, I'm thinking of you specifically on this, because you point out, the goal is 100% revenue, as you said, with 80% of the work. What kind of adjustments then does an organization need to make that happen? How do you achieve it?
Yeah, well, organizations do it in multiple ways. I think how we have understood it in the context of the trials to date is that we we have brought organizations through kind of a pre-trial onboarding phase. So there is a viewpoint that we need to train leaders to think very differently, actually, when embarking on this, and to actually be comfortable with experimentation, to be comfortable with things not being evident straight away, but to have a good understanding of what productivity actually looks like in your workplace, which is actually one of the biggest pitfalls that we find from the get-go when working with organizations. We ask them, how do you measure performance? How do you measure those key activities that drive your business forward? And they don't have the answer to that. So we actually get them to create those versions of dashboards, create orange and green light and red light systems throughout the trial so they can understand the behavioral outcomes that is happening as organizations are actually attempting to reduce working time. We bring them then through actually designing the version of a 4-day week that's going to work for their business. And Grace mentioned this earlier on. This is best done when it's a top-down enabled, but actually a bottom-up designed process. So the version of a 4-day week that works for HR might look very different to the version for your frontline healthcare worker. And so actually involve them in co-designing that process. You're going to get a greater level of intrinsic motivation and buy-in through that process from the get-go. Another way is considering how you're going to communicate this to the relevant stakeholder groups as well. One of the big reasons why organizations tend to not finish trials is that they haven't considered that stakeholder exercise. Have we actually communicated the benefits, the risks, the responsibilities of every stakeholder in actually making sure that something like this gets as good of a chance as it possibly can? So that includes people like management, but also employees, but also external people like shareholders, investors, customers, all of those sort of things. So certain organizations may wish to fully close the business. Others might have that hesitancy for their customers, so they will keep the business open 5 days a week and have a more staggered way of working, where some are working Monday to Thursday, some are working Tuesday to Friday. And they're all the sort of considerations that we ask organizations to consider before actually embarking on something like this. This last thing is that you're training these leaders to understand the science of organizational change. And we know that change is not going anywhere. In fact, it's just going to get increasingly more intense over the next few years. So we need to train leaders to be comfortable with the change journey. In the context of 4-day week, what we see, there's this huge excitement at the beginning, particularly from the employees. They are really looking forward to having more time off. There is then the sheer realization of the work that's involved in actually, changing the business so that it can facilitate working time reduction, which creates a sense of overwhelm in the first sense. We typically find around the 3 to 4 month mark then is when people start to see the light again. So how do we support organizations in order to sustain themselves throughout that journey, and for leaders to motivate the workforce to actually make those changes so that it can be sustainable?
That's really interesting. That sort of initial growth, initial euphoria, and then the sort of reality sinking in that actually it still requires a lot of completely reframing and rethinking of how to do work and how to make it work for time. That's fascinating. I'm wondering for Mariluz, how do you deal with different industries? I mean, as you point out, Spain is proud of its many cultural things, including, for example, very late night culture. I don't know, but dinner doesn't start till at least 8:30 here. And it can go far later into the night. For restaurants, for example, it's a whole industry that deals with very late night work, which, as we know, can be very detrimental for workers as well. So what are the strategies that we can see for different industries that maybe have not the usual 8-hour 9 to 5 workday, but have shifts, have night work? What are the strategies that we can apply?
This is a question of management. In terms of working time management is the most important thing. And in some cases will imply in real new organization and even to have new employment or other kind of employment. We need to consider, and has been mentioned by Dale in some way, that people are not productive all the time that are working. In fact, I said the different statistics prove that if you work theoretically 8 hours per day, only 6 hours and 20 minutes you can be more or less productive. then this is a question of organizing, revising, and considering in a different way. I know it's not easy, for example, to reorganize shifts. This is quite important in some sectors like hospital or all what is care. But it's a question, again, to reorganize, to readjust, to try to consider which are the different needs, and if needed, to create employment. You can create employment in a way that can be not very expensive for the enterprises, because it's a question of, I would say, to organize and to see which is the way to revise all this. One of the most important points is to limit overtime. In Spain, it's very normal that people have enormous hours of overtime that are not compensated even in a more, I would say, more generous way. There are not any compensation, only you are paid as a normal hour of the day. Then if we cut this, we can organize the thing in a different way. We need to really protect people. At the social level, countries like Spain need also to have a organization of some cultural issues related to working time. We have the prime time in TV at midnight. This is incredible. I say, probably there are some people that are looking at us and they will say they are crazy. We are crazy. True. I say, you have mentioned that you start to dinner at 8:30. This could be the foreigners living in Spain. We met at 10 for dinner. Now, this should be conducted in a different way. We cannot change cultural habits, but we need to be aware that all this changing, this cultural working, time use was after our civil war. Why? Because people need to have 2 jobs to survive. Because before, my grandmother was eating at 1 and at 7. Then all has changed in the last century, if you wish. We need to try to do so. It's for this that I mentioned we are proud. We are proud of what? It's what I say, to be fun. This is great. But I don't think fun is related to don't sleep or don't work.
Yeah, and I think you both make a really interesting point, which is that by simply asking a very simple question, can we reduce this time? Can we do more in the time? It's a fundamental rethink of organizations, of how we live, So it's really interesting to see what this opens up, not just for organizations, but cultures as well. Well, let's open it up for some questions from the audience. But before we do that, I want to do this final poll, and now I understand how the poll works. So hopefully I'll do this properly this time. I'm going to read through the poll questions, and they'll come up one by one on the feed there. So just take a quick minute to answer, and then I'll try and get the results to you. So in this final poll, after hearing the panelists in this debate so far, which work schedule do you now prefer? A 4-day work week, reduced daily working hours, or no preference? So I'm going to give the audience some time to answer that question. And in the meantime, maybe I'll ask a question from some of our panelists, because what it sounds like from what I've heard from all of you is that there's no one answer, that the 4-day work week works really well for some organizations, for others it doesn't. So it sounds like, especially from Dale, you're saying that it's really the process of assessing what your organization or what your industry needs. And Grace, if you could answer this question, I mean, how do you start that conversation with organizations when you say, okay, we want to reduce working hours, what do we do?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I think one of the first questions we ask is why they're interested in reducing working hours. Organizations and, different entities will have completely different reasons. Sometimes we're working with people who are interested in having a broader organizational shift and culture change and increasing productivity. Sometimes we're working with organizations that are really just looking at well-being or kind of increasing work-life balance. Sometimes we're working with organizations that many of their staff, have childcare responsibilities, and they're like, I want to be able to do school pickup and school drop off. And so really getting a sense of why and what they're looking for. And then kind of complementing very much what Dale has been saying. Once we do that, understanding what metrics they already use to look at these things. So a lot of organizations that are interested in productivity, as Dale mentioned, aren't actually currently tracking productivity in many ways. And so if that is something they're interested in, it's building collectively, right? It's having that top level buy-in so that staff know that it's something that is pursued, they have support to do it, but also that they're involved in the co-design of the model. And so therefore they have something to really gain and to buy into these shifts that are happening. And so typically we talk about those aspirations, and then we also talk about the risks. I think, there's a lot of conversation about how people really are looking for work time reduction, and there's a lot to be gained, but we also see that a lot of people are really committed to what they do. And if you're working with client services, they want to make sure that the services aren't falling down or things like that. So really co-creating a way that people feel really secure and have the tools that they need to make that transition, while also understanding really clearly what are the end goals that they're looking for. And then kind of, as Dale mentioned, we also talk a lot about adaptations to really facilitate that shift, so people don't feel additional stress to feel like they're doing their current job just in fewer hours and feeling more stressed out about that, but more, what are the organizational chains that can facilitate this productivity? And really kind of facilitating those internal communications as well.
Yeah, we have those poll results in, and I think it reflects what you're saying, that, after hearing the panelists, which work schedule is now preferred, 53% preferred reduced daily working hours, 33% wanted a 4-day work week, 13% had no preference. And I think it reflects maybe some of that anxiety, like, how am I going to get it all done in a 4-day work week? And so it'll be interesting to see, going forward, how people rethink their days and rethink their time. I'm just going to read the second poll question for people to answer. Which argument did you find most compelling? The arguments for the 4-day work week, or the arguments for reduced daily working hours? Or did you find both equally compelling? So take a few seconds to answer that in the poll. We'll see if we get some answers on that. In the meantime, hold on, let me close that out. Giovanni, I'll just ask you a quick question while we wait for some of those. Oh, actually, wait, hold on. We do actually already have some of the votes in. I'll get to your question later. But basically, the argument found most compelling, 44% found both were equally compelling. And maybe that reflects the flexibility of overall reduction of working hours. 33% wanted an overall reduction of daily working hours, and 22% felt that the arguments for a 4-day work week were more compelling. The final question for the poll is, should your organization consider implementing a labor reduction strategy? Yes, definitely, or maybe, but more research is needed, or no, it is not a priority. So take a few seconds to answer that poll, and we'll see. Giovanni, I'm wondering for you, when you have this collective bargaining and you're putting it to employers, to organizations, when they're faced with this question, is it a priority for me? What is the answer that you're getting?
You mean for them, priority?
Yeah, I mean, because you're representing a lot of workers and you're trying to use the collective bargaining power, and they're saying, oh, I don't know, is this a priority for me?
Yes, let's say that, so at European level, social partners, at least the latest discussion we had mentioning this topic, they were not super supportive about this topic. As I mean, I'm referring to European organization representing employers. While their analysis of the pro and cons was quite accurate and let's say honest, when it came to issue some policy recommendation, the first thing they said was, but maybe we don't need now because we have labor shortages, so it's not a priority for the moment. While our argument was actually because we have labor shortages, maybe it is one of the way to resolve this is to reduce working time. So this is the main argument at European level. When it comes to national experience or collective agreements, I mentioned before, in Germany, actually, as Grace mentioned, there has been 2 or 3 good collective agreements signed recently. One in the milk industry, another one in public sectors with Verdi, and there. So something is moving, and when I mean. Unions were very strong in their demands. Like now, IG Metall is pushing since time with this in the metal sector. Also in other industries, the fact that it is so much priority now, also giving the momentum. You know, I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention. Thanks also to all these positive results from the pilots across Europe. The public debate going on, this topic is gaining consensus. So it's also showing to employers that they have something to win in sustainability, in reducing the commuting time, or from an environmental point of view also, to reduce also the days the workers call in sick because they are just tired or they get sick because of too much work. So this showing them numbers, showing them results, it's a good argument for us, for workers, to convince them and to at least try to sit at the table and discuss starting bargaining and to sign agreements. So basically that's what happened in Italy for the agreements I followed a bit.
I think what our poll results have come in have actually reflect that as well. 76%, they would definitely consider a labor reduction strategy. 23% said maybe, but more research is needed. 0% said no, it's not a priority. So I do think that you are seeing, as all of you have pointed out, this sort of general movement to try and reduce working hours and increase productivity. And I think that's definitely winning the argument there. So I'm going to open it up to the floor to the audience. They can send in questions. So please go for it, send them in. In the meantime, I actually already have one question that was sent in, and specifically saying it feels like agriculture and forestry are 2 industries this would be very difficult to apply to. How would you deal with labor reduction hours in these industries? And what about standby times, for example, for emergency medical personnel, firefighters, these kinds of shift work industries that can be very difficult? Why don't we get Dale to answer that first? If you could very briefly, in maybe 2 minutes or so, if you have any, I don't know if you've dealt with any organizations like that, but what were some ideas that you could give our audience?
Yeah, thank you. Luckily, I come from a farming background, so I've been asking my uncles about this. Well, look, I think the general agriculture and forestry sectors are undergoing a huge amount of automation, as is, and I think we haven't even really talked about automation and the role of AI and how that's actually propelling the conversation around working time reduction as well. So I think that's going to play a critical role in those sectors, in particular, that narrative in around that. The versions, I suppose, unique to agriculture is actually historically there was more autonomy over time. It's a lot of self-employed farmers managing their own time. So quantifying time is not the same as, you know, in many sectors where there's management structures and time is, you know, 9 to 5. So I do think we need tailored approaches to understanding those sectors, but I do think that they are being driven by some of those technological innovations as well. The standby time and those more service line sectors as well. We've actually been working with a police department, the City of Golden Policing Department in Colorado. And they brought in a 4-day week. And similar to, I suppose, to how Iceland implemented versions for their public sector, sometimes you do need to consider maybe there is more hiring of staff required actually in some of these sectors. And that might be required to offset some of that cost of the time reduction. But the benefits from a macroeconomic level are, time and time again being shown to be beneficial. So whether it's improved experience of the public in the experiences of these public services, or whether it's a reduction in staff burnout and thus reduction in levels of staff recruitment and retention costs, and more generally then public services and these sort of industries, there is a higher level of liability if something goes wrong. You take healthcare, for example, preventable medical error being the third leading cause of death in the US, and therefore coming with it a huge financial cost associated with that from a medical liability point of view. So sometimes with these industries where it's not as obvious, we do need to think a little bit more broadly around costs and investments as well to make something like this work.
Yeah, I have another question that's come in here. Maybe for Mariluz, this would be a good one, especially from a legislative perspective. How do you measure the success of some of these legislative proposals that you put forward? Because they're very, people can see the theory, but they don't know what it means tangibly. So how would you measure it out? And how would you say this shows this is working?
Where it's difficult to measure the success of things, but I think implementation and application is the only way. Then once we have a law that is already in force and has been applied for, we will say, a short time or medium time, if it's endorsed and accepted by most of the workers and employers of the different sectors or the country in general, we can consider that this is a success in terms of society, if I will say. Later, there are moral success if we comply with international laws, etc., etc. But I think it's a question of, in the case of working time, I would say, is this change in the enterprises and a change in the case, for example, of Spain, in the culture, but it's also in all countries, in the culture of the use of time, that will prove in some way that we have been successful. Will take time. It's difficult, but we will take time. And also happiness. It's very easy to say that people are happier or should be happier. But if we have less mental health problems, if we have less problems of physical illness, etc., this will be a success. And time, I say, the sovereignty of time and also health are really close. And we cannot avoid this. I think I suppose, and I guess in this case, then this will be a clear effect that will prove a success. At least is my point of view, because it's very difficult to measure.
Yeah, and I mean, it's whenever the World Happiness Index comes out, I'm always curious about that because it is so closely related to time. And every time you see that, you realize, yeah, it's got to do with how much of your free time is there for family, outside of work. And I think you make a good point.
If I may, I don't think it's only, I don't know if happiness is the best way to define. I think satisfaction, personal satisfaction, because happiness is complicated. Even though when we talk about personal satisfaction, we are talking about happiness. But anyway, I am not philosopher. I am only a lawyer, a poor lawyer.
It works either way. You get that feeling of, yeah, absolutely, personal satisfaction. Another question is, and this was actually one that I said earlier, what about environmental sustainability? We've talked about productivity as a benefit. Is there a benefit for environmental sustainability? I think Grace Autonomy has done some studies on that. Can you give us a sense of the benefits of work reduction and on the environment?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just pulling up. Yeah. Yes, there's definitely potential environmental sustainability options. So one of the first things that we see is often related to commuting and kind of potential carbon emissions there. But that again does depend on the sector or industry that you're working in. If, say, now we have people who are more likely to be hybrid or remote, some of those some of that work might not necessarily be there, but I definitely recommend Juliet Shore is an academic who's done a lot of work on the environmental sustainability of work time reduction, particularly related to commuting. We also see results around people making more sustainable choices. So if folks are working less, they're more likely to make their own meals, eat at home, and kind of things that are maybe, eating out, which is just a bit more environmentally complex and has a larger carbon footprint. And so we see that in kind of lifestyle choices as well. And then we also see it for industries, say if you are in a manufacturing sector or the work that you're doing in your workplace uses a lot of energy. So you're working with machines or things like that, and you are now closed for an extra day. You are therefore you are not using as much energy as well. So there's kind of multiple areas of thinking about the impact of environmental sustainability. And it will look different for each organization and sector, but there's broadly kind of multiple ways to see that. I saw Giovanni nodding too with the closing of some extra days related to energy use. Yeah.
Yeah, and in many ways it makes sense, right? If you aren't driving, if you aren't taking the takeaway meal with the plastic case and the styrofoam, then yes, you'll be and cooking, you'll be cutting back. But I guess it's hard to know without seeing some numbers, and that's going to take some time. Another question is how, given that you have different kinds of models for different kinds of jobs, how do you ensure that you can get equity and fairness with work reduction across different kinds of sectors? That's a tough one. And I think Grace, you mentioned that's as sort of the percentage, and Dale, I think you also did as well. How do you ensure that it's going to be fair for everyone? I'll start with Dale and then we can.
Okay, that's good. But I'll defer to Grace as well, because I think she has some really good thoughts on this. Well, I think the main thing is actually we're shifting reward away from time towards outcome when we talk about 4-day-week trials. So by actually evaluating people based on performance as opposed to how much time they're able to dedicate towards the workplace or the work, that automatically shifts the balance of influence of particular actors within workplaces who already disproportionately benefit, i.e. Males. So we know that women typically and historically are always more time poor, particularly through that second shift of labor. So if a man is able to stay beyond the 9-to-5 schedule and his bosses or her bosses, looking at them doing that, they might be more likely to reach promotion. Whereas if we're being much more clear and transparent with regards to what performance and evaluation of performance looks like, then women are much more likely to benefit in those sort of systems. Similarly, though, the other side of equity is actually around what I mentioned, looking at this as a policy for all. And by doing so, you're actually encouraging men to take time away from work and to take on greater distribution of other work outside of the formal workplace. And we've seen that in the UK trial, the increase in parenting time, the increase in household labor conducted by men. And oftentimes those men were actually saying, this is the first time I felt organizational permission to take time away from work as well. So when talking about equity, we need to consider it from that point of view of both, and stop pitting them against each other, but actually realize that there's benefits here for everyone if we do it as a policy for all.
Yeah, I really echo what Dale says. And I think kind of also related to that is when you're providing opportunity for workers to be involved in co-designing, you're also providing opportunities for equity. We see adaptations relating to meeting culture, and there's a lot of ways that you can have an organizational shift that perhaps will be better for staff who are neurodivergent and who have different kinds of needs. And so equity in the workplace can also look like that, where you're facilitating new conversations about about ensuring that people are represented in that. And then just kind of also the role in union involvement. If you're looking across different sectors and folks are, you know, thinking about how that looks like in the broader economy, I mean, that's a huge question, especially when you're looking at, you know, sectors, organizations, industries who are all doing very different things. But again, that goes back to kind of legislation, legal requirements like standard working time. What is the precedent there, and then how does that apply and look like it at each individual space? So recognize that's a large answer, but large question.
But it's good. It's good for people to think about. Well, I think we're coming to the end. So if I could get a final thought from each of you. Giovanni, why don't we start with you? What
Yes, thank you. Just to echo what Dale and Grace were saying. So this had an impact on the gender aspect as well. Of course, as we mentioned, especially the fact that men and women can more easily share domestic responsibilities, and also that it could narrow sometimes the gender pay gap as well. Working less hours reduce also the penalties of part-times or involuntary part-times for women. And another thing is to take into consideration is the wealth inequalities. The fact that we can reduce wealth inequalities and improve work-life balance, especially for low-wage workers, because they will have more time to manage personal and family responsibilities, such as childcare, grocery, shopping, other household tasks. And this is important since low-wage workers often cannot afford to pay someone else to do these activities, like the wealthy people can do. So this will reduce also the long-term inequalities while having more hours to rest, exercise, leisure activities can improve their mental health, physical health. So could be also more energized to go to work with more enthusiasm, then potentially have more productivity, be more productive at the workplace. So this was just to echo. To conclude, let me thank you again. It has been such a good discussion. As I said, the TUC is very committed to push for this topic. First of all, through collective bargaining. But as I said, we really appreciate that some national government is pushing for legislation to cap the hours through law. Just to announce you that TUC has also commissioned a study analyzing existing pilots of collective bargaining and all the arguments for working time reduction. I see Grace nodding, and the results should be ready in November. So we will be happy to share with you as well.
Oh, that's great. That's good to know. So there'll be something to look forward to in November for that. Fantastic. Thank you, Giovanni. Mariluz, any concluding thoughts from you, especially as you're seeing this law being put together? What's your feelings going forward in terms of the progress we've made?
I would take 2 seconds to thank again to everyone for inviting me to participate in this interesting debate and to be here. What I will say is the debate is open and cannot be closed with no solution. I think it is time to review working time. This cannot be only a debate, the ideological debate is in the hands of not only governments, also social partners, and is key. If we cannot improve on this, we will have serious problems in the next years. Then what I will say is to encourage the discussion at whatever has any possibility to put this in the political agendas, to encourage and really to push for. At the same time, of course, we need always the institutions that are making research that will support any evidence and will support the result. But it's time now, if I will say like this, to use what is the subject of this summer school, it's time now to talk about time, in particular working.
Thank you. No, I couldn't agree more. Dale and Grace, any concluding remarks from you on what you'd like to see going forward? Why don't we start with Dale?
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And great to see such great work happening across Europe. 4 things, 2 of which are mine, and then 2 of which are people who are much smarter than me. The first being that time is a constant relative to money. So when looking at value systems in the future and how we reward people, we can create more wealth or more money as such, but we can't create more time. So in and economies and societies are going to be constantly changing. Time as a constant is going to be a hugely beneficial benefit to give people back. And what's driving that in many instances actually is the emergence of Generation Z, who are bringing with them the new value systems that the American dream is no longer worth fighting for because it no longer exists in totality. The third point is a quote then from Eugene McCarthy, which we haven't explicitly talked about it, but it's something that COVID has caused for many of us, is this idea that leisure is not, as they suppose, a drain on the economy, but a lubricant. Leisure is like the rain that nourishes abundant consumer crops. So we need to actually start viewing time off as actually a thing that can help business, not infringe upon it. And as if we wouldn't be ending a conversation around the economy without mentioning Keynes. So Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?
I love that. That's a good quote to end on for sure. How about you, Grace? What are your thoughts moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. As always, echoing everyone, thank you so much. I've learned also so much being on the panel with you all, and to everyone also behind the scenes, there's been a lot of incredible work. Echo a lot of what people said, but I think one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is kind of when you free up time from from wage labor, we also see this uptick in pro-social activity. So especially as we move forward into potentially tumultuous times, given many different crises impacting our nation's society and the world, that also provides us an opportunity to be where we need to be, spending our energy and working towards what we want to see for the world. So this is just one step in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. No, absolutely. There's a lot of food for thought. And it's really amazing how a very simple question can make you really rethink time and how you use that time. And I think some really interesting things here. And it definitely seems like the momentum is there. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the Time Use Initiative for putting this out there and for all of you, the participants on this call. We really appreciate it. Some really great discussions today. Thank you.